Tell me, how many lights do you see?
See four lights.
No, I'm afraid you're mistaken. Look again. Tell me, how many lights do you see?
Four lights.
I just don't understand how you are coming up with that number. Again, how many lights do you see?
Four lights.
If you are wondering why Captain Picard is on the thumbnail, it's one of those things. If you know, you know. It's a kind of a famous episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation involving four lights. But I guess for our purposes here at Railroad Economics, is Captain Picard right? How many lights are there on the front of a locomotive? Well, in this case, he is right. There are four lights, at least on most modern American locomotives. So here's the weird part: those bottom two lights, they're not really there to help the engineer see, not at all. They're actually there to help you see the train. And the reason locomotives have them involves more than a century of railroad lighting, some wonderfully strange experiments, and a federal rule that changed the face of American locomotives. My name is Mark Magana, and this is Railroad Economics, where we discuss the business behind the trains. For most of railroad history, lighting a locomotive was a much bigger problem than you might imagine. The earliest locomotives had headlights, but they were basically just big lanterns. Oil was used. Later on, it was kerosene. Reflectors were placed behind that flame to throw as much light down the track as possible. And these things, they just weren't exactly lighting up the countryside, as you might imagine. Their purpose was partly to help the crews see what was ahead, but also to make this enormous moving machine visible to everyone else down the track. Eventually, electricity came about and that changed everything. By the 20th century, powerful electric headlights could throw a beam hundreds of feet down the track. But railroads discovered they had another problem. A single bright light told you something was coming. It didn't necessarily do a great job telling you what you were looking at or how quickly it was getting closer. And railroads tried some pretty interesting solutions. One of the coolest was the Mars light, and the Mars light deserves its own episode. But starting in the 1930s, these things showed up on locomotives from railroads, including Southern Pacific and the Chicago Northwestern. Instead of simply shining straight ahead, the beam moved around, often tracing sort of a figure eight pattern. It really made it hard to miss. Other railroads experimented with oscillating lights, strobe lights, different combinations of warning lights, and that basic idea, making the locomotive more conspicuous rather than simply making its headlight brighter, eventually leads us here. The two lights down here are generally called ditch lights, and despite their name, their most important job isn't illuminating a ditch on the side of the track. Their job is making the locomotive easier to recognize as an approaching train, especially at grade crossings. In the early 1990s, the Federal Railroad Administration was studying different ways to make locomotives more conspicuous, and there wasn't really one obvious winner at first. In 1993, interim federal rules recognized several different approaches, including ditch lights, crossing lights, strobes, oscillating lights. So, for a while, the future of locomotive lighting could have looked very, very different from what we have today, but ultimately, the familiar two light arrangement is what won out. In 1996, the FRA issued its final rule on auxiliary locomotive lighting. Beginning on December 31st, 1997, a lead locomotive operating at more than 20 miles per hour over a public highway rail crossing needed auxiliary lights in addition to its headlight. And this is where the placement gets interesting. The federal rule specifically calls for two white auxiliary lights positioned to form a triangle with the locomotive's headlight. That's why a modern locomotive looks like this. one headlight assembly up top, an auxiliary headlight assembly generally right below it, and the ditch lights here. That triangle isn't an accident. It creates a large, recognizable pattern that makes an approaching locomotive very conspicuous. After 30 years of this, it's hard to imagine a locomotive without ditch lights. And because the lights are separated, they provide a much bigger visual signature than one extremely bright point of light down the track. The FRA wasn't trying to help the engineer spot a deer a mile away. It specifically said the purpose was to help motorists, railroad employees, and pedestrians recognize approaching trains from greater distances. And despite what we usually call them, the federal regulation doesn't actually insist they be called ditch lights. As far as the government's concerned, they're actually called auxiliary lights. It also doesn't say every railroad has to bolt them onto exactly the same spot. There are minimum heights, minimum spacing requirements, and brightness standards. But railroads have a lot of flexibility in how they satisfy the FRA's requirements, which is why not all the locomotives look alike. Norfolk Southern is a great example of this. NS has traditionally been known for putting the main headlight above the cab windows, above the conductor and the engineer on most of its locomotives, while the ditch lights remain much lower. If you've never noticed that before, now you know. When the headlights are way up high, NS is the only major railroad that orders them that way. Everybody else has them on the nose. But either way, whether it's on the nose or whether it's above the cab, it still creates the required triangle. So both arrangements do satisfy the rules. And NS has another interesting lighting quirk. On some locomotives, you'll find ditch lights at both ends of the locomotive. That makes more sense when you know a little bit about Norfolk Southern's history. Its predecessors, Southern Railway and Norfolk and Western, famously operated many locomotives long hood forward, what young eyes or modern eyes would consider the back of the locomotive. A locomotive, a modern diesel locomotive, doesn't really care if it's going forwards or backwards. It's all the same to the locomotive. It's not like your car that has a transmission and that regulates speed and gearing and stuff like that. A locomotive doesn't care. And Southern and Norfolk Western did operate locomotives long hood forward. On some of those locomotives, the long hood was literally designated as the front. If you're ever standing next to a locomotive at what is traditionally the front that we think of today, you'll notice there's a little letter F up there. That is to delineate it, to differentiate it, to tell you it's the front. Well, on some older Norfolk Western Southern locomotives, the F was in what we would call the back. You can still occasionally see an NS local operating long hood forward today, particularly when a locomotive needs to make a return trip and there's nowhere convenient to turn it around. If either end of the locomotive should end up in the lead, having the correct equipment at both ends makes a lot of sense, right? There are a couple of other details hidden in the rules. The ditch lights don't necessarily have to flash. Federal regulators allow them to burn steadily, but if a railroad uses flashing auxiliary lights at crossings, they have to alternate between 40 and 180 flashes per minute. How did they decide somewhere between 40 and 180? I have no idea, but that is what they decided, and that's a big margin. So I'm sure somebody had a reason, but I could not find an answer to that. And the lights themselves, they're actually a serious piece of equipment. Each auxiliary light has to meet federal intensity requirements, reaching as high as 200,000 candela under one of the permitted standards. What's a candela? Well, that's standard candle power. So one standard candle is one candela. So it has to be as bright as 200,000 candles to meet the federal requirements. Even the headlight on the nose or on top of the locomotive is also regulated. It has to be aimed so it can illuminate a person at least 800 feet ahead. So, what if you're weird and you want to buy a railroad headlight to put on your house or something? Well, you can. The old incandescent style of light bulbs that they used are about 25 bucks a piece. However, the new more modern LEDs per headlight on a locomotive, they cost a little over $500. That's an expensive light bulb. And interestingly, federal law considers a headlight to be either one or two lamps, which finally explains four lights.
I see four lights.
What looks like four lights on a typical modern locomotive is generally two lamps making up the main headlight, plus two auxiliary or ditch lights down low. But legally and functionally, you're really looking at one headlight and two auxiliary lights, three lighting positions, but four actual lamps. And because this is railroad economics, I have to point out all of this costs money, not just the lights themselves. Thousands of locomotives had to be equipped or modified back in the late 90s. The equipment has to be inspected, failed lights have to be repaired, and federal rules can even restrict what happens to a lead locomotive when the auxiliary light fails. But compare that expense to the expense that having these lights is trying to prevent. A grade crossing collision can destroy equipment, interrupt the railroad's main line, delay multiple trains, damage cargo, generate an enormous liability, and far more importantly, it could kill someone. Railroads move billions of dollars worth of freight through tens of thousands of public crossings. Making a locomotive easier to recognize before it reaches a crossing is a relatively inexpensive layer of protection. So, those two extra lights aren't really about giving the engineer a better view of the track. They're about making a 200-ton locomotive coming toward you considerably harder to miss. And once you know that,
How many lights are there? Four lights.
you'll probably never look at those four lights quite the same way again. Thank you so much for watching Railroad Economics. My name is Mark Magana. Please like, subscribe, do the things, watch more videos, and I will see you next time.